to a brief training on scoring the teaching practices portfolio at Young Harris College. I'm starting this morning with a look at the rubric to walk everyone through the columns first, A through G. In this rubric, each standard, which is represented in column A, will be scored according to conceptual integration, which is represented in column B and scored in column C, as well as students' engagement in specific actions that represent teaching practices that are desired, column D, scored in column E, with an opportunity for the rater to make notes for the students and for herself in column F under areas for improvement. You can see in column G, for my own reference, I've added a copy of the Georgia TAPS scoring rubric so that I can reference it. All right, let's go back to column A. This morning I'd like to look at Standard 2, Instructional Planning. Under Standard 2, Instructional Planning, my first task as I read the teaching practices portfolio submitted by a particular student is to rate, I'm in column B, rate the integration of concepts and concrete examples. And the prompt has given me some examples of the kinds of concepts where I should be looking for integration. So around big ideas like planning, curricular goals, assessment, and student needs. Now, in each program and with each of us as teacher educators, and in any other stakeholder, there may be other important concepts that spring to mind for them as sort of core central representations of this standard. So these are just given as suggestions or as examples, and we can revise this list to make it more complete based on consensus within our faculty. So in order to kind of put a real situation here, if we can see this work, I'm going to cut to an example from some student work. So here I'm looking at a student's submission for their instructional planning. This link goes to their flipped lesson, which they submitted for a summer course. She's listed the standard there, and she says, I created a flipped lesson for our technology integration course that used educational technology with a focus on dialect and storytelling. So my student is trying to make a connection between the standard and her understanding of that standard and actual concrete things she's done. My first task on the teaching practice portfolio is to rate the effectiveness of her connection making and her integration of the concepts that go with this Standard 2 instructional planning and the examples that she's able to marshal. So she says, I formatted this lesson to meet the needs of all my students by providing multiple modes of content sharing. To discuss the topic of dialogue, I started by having the students read an excerpt of a short story with lots of dialogue present and answer relevant reflection questions. Following this activity, we'll listen to a clip of the dialogue to gain a better understanding, especially for students who don't naturally understand best through reading comprehension. I wanted to take the opportunity to appeal as many of their senses and skills as possible. We then moved into a discussion about dialect in their lives and how their families produced certain words. This allowed the students to make a genuine connection with the concept of dialect, not just in the confines of the classroom. This relates back to the theory of connectivism as students are building on their pre-existing knowledge and adding to it. And so she continues. So my challenge is to make a determination as to the extent to which she is integrating concepts such as planning or student needs, curricular goals with concrete examples. So in this case, we only have one concrete example, but it does seem to me that she has been successful in working conceptually with the standard and drawing on examples from her work that do fit that example. So in column C, conceptual integration score, I would choose a 3 because the conceptual integration was effective. The examples were not extensive, and she was mostly working to make the case that that she had met the standard with her examples, and so this is a good example of effectiveness. I would then move on to column D and E and use the additional information which is below here, where she continues with her. I can't scroll down in my screen share, but below here, oh, I know I can. How cool is that? So there's a required element where it says explain how anticipated evidence of intermediate development integrates understanding of beginner concepts and practices with anticipated responsive teaching activities. She says in this case, the anticipated evidence of intermediate development would be the student's ability to recognize dialect in another text and be able to understand the general meaning. This would show that the kids have a beginner understanding that other people pronounce words differently. This relates to the standard, and then she's given the standard. And so as I go back to my rubric, I have 2 places to discuss her conceptual integration. Did she continue to talk about planning and student needs effectively? I think she did. She's still a 3 on column C. But now I look to the candidate keys rating and I say, is she being consistent in thinking about planning with student needs in mind? I believe that her writing does show that she's doing that. And so she would be rated for her consistency and earn a 3 here. Now, I happen to know, because I taught this class and I taught this student, that her responses largely emanate from feedback that I gave her about a flipped lesson draft that was quite different and responded quite differently to anticipated student needs, or rather did not anticipate diverse student needs, and was much less responsive or anticipating their prior knowledge. And so in my areas for improvement, I might make a note that the writing context and the revision process seems to have really helped her here, but this is one to watch for whether there is a potential issues with integration in her daily practice, which in fact there have been. The first lesson that I observed from her was entirely front-loaded, and it was about comma rules, as if students, had no knowledge of comma use, and it wasn't integrated with writing, and so there were some ways in which the observed lesson looked much more like a previous draft of the one that she describes here. But this gets to why portfolios are so helpful, because we can see that with help, this particular teacher candidate is able to integrate important concepts, and she is able, when writing, to produce a certain amount of consistency in her actions and decision making as a teacher. So for me, she's a C. She's a 3 in conceptual integration, and she's a 3 in candidate keys. But I've identified a potential area for improvement because I'm aware that her ability to demonstrate understanding in writing with help in this particular process may be moving in advance ahead of her ability to integrate those practices in the classroom. I think that speaks positively both to her as a candidate, but also to the way this process is supposed to work, to provide students an opportunity to generate and learn as they compose these projects.